that he might have encountered First Nations people who would have said to him, would have shared their experiences with him, and that in those encounter groups there would have like a nascent question of decolonial politics in Vancouver in the 1970s, which is where David Berner comes in, who we just saw on the beach, who's the guy who set up X-Kalay in 1967, and we wanted him to come and lead a encounter group session, but it didn't quite work out. And I also very strongly recognise that this project is speaking to Euro-Canadians, settler communities, people largely educated in English-speaking art schools, educational establishments in Canada and elsewhere, and that's the audience to whom this question of decolonisation at this stage is addressed. So I'm not addressing it to First Nations people. I'm addressing it primarily to us, who are people educated at institutions. And I understand that it's not as simple as that there are people of mixed ancestry who, and I think that's very important too, because mixed ancestry is something which I think clearly there'd been mixing going on in Canada for generations, which means that it's not a simple question of people who are of one side of the cultural difference and the other. They're everybody, not everybody, but many people have familiar alliances and relations to people who are both First Peoples, settlers, and a variety of peoples in between. So the initial sort of question is, how do we go about discussing the decolonisation of thought in a country which is still imperial, in the sense that one of the things Philip K. Dick kept saying after his visions of 1974 was the empire never ended. The empire never ended. And I'm using that statement as a kind of provocation to say that did the empire ever really end in British Columbia? And if so, what does it mean to try and decolonise our thinking within that context if the empire is still actually in place, and how does that? So that's the first question to go out there. What does it mean to decolonise thought when the empire never ended? So maybe people want to respond to that or not, or is it?
Which empire do you think he meant?
He was talking about Rome. His vision was in 1974. Dick had a vision that Rome and California, Rome 70 AD and California 1974, actually were holographically stacked on each other, and they were connected by something that he called a black iron prison. The black iron prison was this structure, trans-temporal structure, which was keeping everybody trapped. To cut a long story short, he had a vision through an ichthys symbol on a necklace that somebody who was bringing in medication in 1974 was wearing, that blasted him with a pink beam, that told him repeatedly the empire never ended. You're still in the black iron prison of the Roman Empire. California, he was talking about Nixon era California. I'm just running with that and saying this is British Columbia. British Columbia is still ruled by the same Queen that rules the UK. The Queen of Canada is the Queen of the UK. She's still the constitutional head of state. When you take on a legal battle in British Columbia, you're fighting the Crown. So I'm wondering if what it means to start the process of decolonisation intellectually, when politically the imperial structure, legally let's say, is still in place. And isn't it just cosmetic, or are we just paying lip service when we acknowledge that this is unceded territory? And those are the kind of issues I'm trying to bring up. So if that makes sense, Dick was talking about the Roman Empire. I'm talking about the British.
Or American.
Or American Empire.
I mean, the empire shifted hands, right? Like some of the residue of the Roman Empire is in the, look at the White House and its architecture, right? So it's that kind of aesthetic. But one of the things that strikes me is the fact that Dick came to BC, wasn't from here, and had a vision about BC, and you've come from England, and you've come here, and you've got this other vision. So it's just, talked about this, but intriguing that we're sort of talking about it through the vision of two people who aren't from here, and trying to talk about what does it mean to be here.
Yeah.
It's like, strikes me as very ironic.
Why ironic?
Well, it's like how we're in Stanley Park right now.
Yeah.
And just last year there was a vote to retain that name and not go with the previous name that the first peoples had given to the place. There was a village over there on the other side of the park.
Yeah. And yet
It's a there's always these stream of projections in a way. And yet there was a time when nobody was here.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I understand as well, and I recognise, and I speak quite humbly to Canadians, both settlers and First Nations Canadians, as a non-Canadian, that I know you've been dealing with this for a long time, and that we haven't. But the connection comes primarily from the fact that I can come here. And I can come here quite easily and smoothly because I speak English, and so do you all. And that linguistic fact is not a mere accident. The fact that we went to school together, the fact that we studied in London and the UK, that we know each other through the educational establishments that we studied at, the learning that we have shared, that we still share and continue to share with others, is all part of a broader imperial machine that we benefit from and we continue to be part of. So although I don't live here, I feel very strong affinity with my colleagues and friends and who do. And the conversations we have to do with the worlds we've inhabited. And we have shared a world, and the world that we've shared is an artistic, international, educational, English-speaking world that we continue to inhabit. So although we don't live on a daily basis, the contradictions of living on unceded territories as ancestors of settlers. Some of our ancestors are your ancestors.
I think as well, I mean, we've partly come here to find out what decolonization means, and people talk about it like in theory in London, like it's really like a super cool word in London at the moment, theory. And we don't, and in a way it's not that different, although it's a very different context, but we're all using this word, and then we come here and there's actually, a really sort of material sense, and the text that Jay shared about decolonization is not a metaphor. That was really, that's really strong. That's maybe should the lands be literally, materially decolonized, and what would that do, and how would that work? And that's, we talked about this the other day, and the fact that's probably not ever likely to happen. But can we use decolonization? Can we decolonize our thinking, and will that make things better? And how would that even work? And thinking in terms of, say, Viveiros Castro, whose Cannibal Metaphysics we've sort of been looking at, and that idea of like taking on other ways of thinking and not putting ourselves at the centre. Is that possible, and is that a good thing, and is that anyway?
Jay, you want to say?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, there's so many things. Like, I guess first thing I want to say is that like it's a really different, I just want to recognize that for me what we're doing here is probably a really different conversation than normally we would do as academic artists, where I think usually we're coming in and sharing this, like, I don't know, using common words, and like you're saying, and like trying to there's sort of a level of like asserting what I know, or something like this, and that's why I think the idea of having someone come in and do an encounter group would have been really awesome. And maybe that'd still be what this is, because I think a lot of it is us recognizing our ignorance, and I think there's definitely a level of discomfort that comes around that you said, I really read in that wonderful email that you sent, where it's just like, I feel like I'm taking on too much, like what is this? And I feel a certain sense of guilt. I feel also in this context, I also feel like I do a lot of reading on this and thinking about it, but I also don't want to come across as an expert, because I don't think there's such thing as an expert. So I think maybe that's where I want to start, is just like just to recognize that like maybe this is a bit of a different situation than we're usually in, where we can just be like, I don't fucking know, I don't, you know, and like I don't, you know, or to say something that's okay to sound stupid, right? And I think that's probably where we're all in the place of being a little bit stupid. So yeah, and I guess like my background is like, because I might say some things because I've done a lot of thinking on it, but I just want to sort of also recognize that like I'm sort of trying to figure out how I can, in the way that you introduce where we are right now, try to introduce where I am, and like the best way I can do it, just to sort of preface this like, a little bit, is like my family is partly from long time from Newfoundland. The story I tell about my family now is that there was Irish fishermen who would come over, and to stay here for over the winter, they had to marry into Mi'kmaq communities, which is the nation there. So an Irishman married a Mi'kmaq woman, and sort of there's just a long history of this in Newfoundland. So I mean, I'm trying to deal with like the situation out there is very different than it is here. And so I see myself as someone who's like a settler here, and dealing with the same sorts of things. It's just like, wow, like what does property ownership mean, and what does it mean that I'm a renter on Lone Island, and I struggle, like I wish I could own property.
Yeah.
But in the, you know, when you're reading that stuff about decolonization, like to me, decolonization, like what is that word? What does decolonizing mean? What does colonizing mean? And to me, it is about land. Like it is about colonization is about, yes, maybe it can happen here, but it's also about people taking land and transforming what's happened there and how people use that place. So I think it's like, when I think about how we can decolonize thinking, to me it moves really quickly into a physical space, and like how are we taking action? Because talking isn't, and maybe that's like a local thing to this, but I think it's really important. Like that essay said, like this shit's for real, and it's like fucking hurtful. Like Randy and I were on a talk with Cease Weiss, who's of Hawaiian and Squamish descendants, and we walked around Stanley Park, around this area, which is called Stanley Park by most people.
Can I come sit?
And she was telling us about the trees. Like she was going, like these cedars are, we see them as our ancestors. Like our people have lived here for so long that our DNA, we're buried in the soil here. Our DNA is grown into these trees, and so they're like, we don't see this is part of of who we are. But it's almost like invisible, right? So we're all here talking about it, and when I think about I'm sort of going all over the place, but when I think about the empire has never ended, I think like the counter argument might be our empire has never ended, and like maybe what someone who lives here might say, or someone who's from here would say. First off, they would say, actually, we have lived here. Our cosmology says we've lived here since time immemorial. There was never a time when people weren't here. That's how they would probably see it, right? This place came to be with us. And they would say, our empire has never ended. We've been here, but you've forgotten and you're not paying attention to it. Yeah. And we're trying to show you that. And we're even trying to rename this place, but you don't want that because it's too hard to pronounce or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, and I think that's really important to recognize that, like, that's the fight, I think, would be for us to recognize that those nations have never ceased to exist, and they're trying, and there's a lot of battles, continual battles on asserting their sovereignty, right? So there's some shit to think about, I guess. That's all about that.
There was something that struck me in that text that you sent about how when people moved, so European settlers moved here, they called themselves settlers rather than immigrants. And the sort of thing about immigration being taken on, if you immigrate somewhere, you take on the existing rules of the land, but if you colonize, you take over. So I don't know, I think it's quite interesting to think of settlers that, if settler community thought of themselves as actually immigrants to an already an empire, that would be a really, really different, that would take such, such a shift of thinking. And that might be a start to thinking about how things could work.
Well, one more quick story about land use. I think this is really, because for anybody who read that, they didn't really go into what, like when we say it's impossible, like I know what you mean. It seems like it's a crazy idea to think that how would we surrender all of this land, right?
And
but
people have lived here for generations too.
Yeah, but I guess the premise of it is that the land shouldn't be owned by anybody. So surrendering the land isn't giving property back. And the story I have is one that's told about when people first came to Mi'kma'ki, to the eastern provinces, which was some of the first sort of travels from Europe over here, the first sort of encounters. What they said was, this land isn't ours, it's here to share. And there are certain ways of doing that, which is you just take as much as you need, and that's it. So you're welcome as guests. It's not ours, come as guests, and we're all here together. And that was how so it wasn't initially a colonization or settling, it was as immigrants, basically. It was like, these are the rules, the laws of the land. But then really quickly, ownership started to be, they said, well, this is ours now. Now we have a fort here. And so if you're going to come into the fort, then this is the way it has to be. And suddenly that idea of this is ours and not yours came to be. So, so I think it's about, I don't know if it's possible to surrender or not, to surrender all the land or not, but I can see what they mean about property ownership. Like to say that it's this is my land, I bought this, so it's mine, is really fucked up, I think.
See, you know.
And it's like it's at the least it's overlapping, right? At the least there's. I mean, what do you do about a place like this where they're like, well, this is my ancestors are buried here. I don't know. It's really.
Well, I think one is to recognize it, that history. So, I mean, I keep thinking about decolonizing thought, and I hear what you're saying, that it's not just thought. It has to make its way into our actions and activities, absolutely. And some of us are doing that in different ways, and some not. But I do think there's something distinct to decolonizing thought, which is the phrase, right? It's not. We're not talking about decolonization. We're not talking about decolonizing society. Like, it's decolonizing thought, and I think that's very interesting. What is thought? We talked a little bit about the other night about, is it cognition and is it ours, or. But I think that just recognizing what has been done to Indigenous peoples, because most of the family that I came from, there was no recognition of that. So that, I think, is the beginning of, if not decolonizing the reality of it, is decolonizing the idea that doesn't exist. Or, like, if you don't really go into it, which is really difficult, traumatic, you don't have to think about it, right? So.
I get it, but I think something that's speaking of this land use, it's something that's been, I try to say as succinctly as possible, but I'm a Marxist. I was shaped by Marxist thinking, and so there's always been this problem with property and ownership, and the concept of ownership is one of the fundamental categories of Marxist critique of, like, well, property, he didn't say property is theft, Proudhon said that, and one of the things that Marx, I don't particularly talk about Marx anymore, I'm talking about it now, because it seems really relevant, that Marx always said that it's one, you can talk and talk and talk, but actually, unless you change the relations of ownership of the means of production, the land, territory, then it's all hot air. Because unless you change that basic structure of who owns, then it's just nothing's going to change. And I keep coming back to this feeling that, and I speak as somebody who, quite frankly, because I've always been on the left, I've always rejected ownership, property ownership. But increasingly in a city like London, in a country like the UK, it is becoming increasingly impossible to rent. One has to find a way to own, like rent it
to survive.
Yeah. So we are being forced into a position of thinking about ownership, which goes really against all our values, which are socialist values, that we'd like to just actually rent property, maybe from the state, and there's all sorts of things. Increasingly there's less and less option not to own. And that seems to me like how capitalism, people complain about capitalism, but I really see that fundamentally it seems to have always been about drawing divisions in land and saying, this is owned by X, whether it's the Crown, it's no longer yours. You look at the map of Vancouver from when the first contact came, they just divided the whole place up into grids like this. Stanley Park was a naval base. And they gave the local people, the native people, a tiny territory in Granville Island, about this 1 square mile, but the rest of the area was just already given logging companies, individuals. They carved the whole fucking territory up and said, this is owned. Right? Now that's always been a problem if you're a Marxist, right? That was the beginning of, that's what you had to struggle against, but it's gone so far now that I don't know if we can struggle against it anymore. That's why I feel a little bit defeated by it. And I don't know what we do if we can't fight against the fact that those who've laid claim to property, whose family have owned those, who have inherited that stolen territory for generations, like in UK, the Crown territories, they still ultimately control that. And unless you can win it back off them, how do you get it back? And I just wonder if you can't get it back, whether or not we're just kind of like all trapped in this, well, we need to buy somewhere, we need to live somewhere, we better look for a property in Powell River or, I don't know, Victoria or Salt Spring or Winnipeg or wherever, because we can't afford to live. And as artists, of course, we stupidly are voluntarily poor, right? Because most of us have chosen a path in life that means we're not going to make any money. We're not going to be that executive stockbroker with like a yacht and a trailer and two, we've rejected that, right? And part of the artistic choice was to reject that materialist thing. But then we reach 45, 50, and we go, how the fuck are we going to live? Shit, we're going to have to buy somewhere. And so, we end up buying, I don't know, so I'm sorry for overstating that, but for me there's something very direct about the reality of trying to live ethically without property when everywhere is being bought, increasingly bought up, and everyone is going like, well, you'd be crazy not to. Sorry.
But that's
Don't be sorry, it's awesome, I totally agree.
Yeah.
But now, if there is no solution on the short term for this problem, then maybe the solution is very long term. Like, if you say you transform now every property into a temporary property and lease of 99 years or 125 years or whatever, and you tell people now, okay, when this time will arrive, then you will lose the rights to the property.
It already exists here, that model.
Yeah?
People just buy more years.
You can buy more years, so it's a lease, like in England also.
Yeah.
Like you buy lease on the land, you own the walls, but you buy lease on the lands, and you can buy more and more and more. But if you were to stop this and to stay at some point, then in 4 times 25 years or whatever, then you can just change the system.
Well,
but
that's where I come back to capitalism is this reality, this material reality of it. But it is a thought, it's an idea, it's an ideology. So decolonizing thought is about acknowledging what has happened, but it's also realizing that your thoughts are colonized by the world and society you live in. So thought can, we're doing it in the sense of being aware what the problems are. I do think thought has its material implications in some way, and it's long term. Right?
Yeah, we would need to change the way that most people think in order to change the way things work.
I was just thinking about the other night when we were saying we need to change the way people think. We need to convert people. Like who's we and what's this?
Well,
Strikes me as funny. But yeah, I know. I agree. It's about a shift in consciousness, right?
Can I just say a point that I made? I was talking to Nathan the other day about this. the Brexit thing in the UK, I don't know if you know about it, but it was an really interesting moment for us because